The role of Hadith in Ikhtilāf. The approach of the companions towards Ahadith. It is on a whole accepted by all orthodox Sunni madhabs that several of the disputes found among the later scholars were similar to those of the companions. All Sunnis believe that the companions were the most learned, God-fearing and pious people after the Prophet himself. So it would probably be best to study their approach towards Ahad Hadith. Generally, it appears that the companions accepted all authentic Ahad narrations without any specific restrictions, and Shafi'i in his Risala quotes many such narrations to validate the claim that all Ahad Hadith, which are authentic, should be accepted on the same grounds that other Hadith are. Ar-Razi, on similar lines of thought, not only cited Quranic verses, ahadith and logical arguments for upholding ahad hadith, which he claimed were a consensus that had existed amongst the companions, that sahih ahad hadith are all valid and must be abided by. This claim seems justifiable since nobody has cited any authentic hadith for being ahad as such. However, it is known that Abu Bakr was amongst the first companions that started becoming cautious in accepting the ahadith attributed to the Prophet. This is exhibited when a grandmother claimed a large share in the inheritance of her grandchild. On being turned down because she did not have any hadith supporting her claim, Al-Mughira testified that he heard the Prophet saying, "Grandmothers receive a sixth." Abu Bakr, however, asked him to bring forward a second companion in support of his statement. Whenceforth, Muhammad ibn Maslama al-Ansari gave testimony and substantiated Al-Mughira's hadith. It is also reported that Umar was very harsh upon those who often reported a hadith of the Prophet, and he often asked for a second companion when one claimed hearing hadith dealing with legislative issues. Ali too is reported to have imposed upon companions to swear an oath of truth when reporting to him a hadith of the Prophet. The Prophet himself once turned to the rest of the companions for further proof in the mosque when a companion came to him saying that he, the Prophet, had not completed his prayers fully. Umar once even rejected Fatima bint Qays's hadith pertaining to the alimony of divorced women. Ali also once rejected Maqal ibn Sinan's hadith pertaining to the rights of the widowed women without a dowry being fixed for them. Because these very few anomalies in the overall approach of the companions, some scholars consequently understood that these anomalies were in general adopted by the companions, in spite of the volumes of narrations which clearly indicated otherwise. It is ironical that some of the contemporary scholars even think of rejecting ahad hadith or the necessity of supporting them with other usul. This is in and of itself entrenched. This is in itself an entrenched asl. Therefore, I shall attempt to now disprove the validity of such allegations. As for Abu Bakr's cautiousness in accepting ahadith only when one example is given above, this exists and is too invalidated by Ibn Hazm on grounds that some defect in its chain of narration. As for Umar, on the tens of narrators which indicate otherwise, Azami states that only 4 incidents to the contrary are reported of Umar. It would seem futile to adopt and design a full school of thought on the basis of only a handful of narrations in the face of hundreds and probably thousands of others which point to the contrary. Azami says, there is no doubt as to the feebleness of such a school which turns a blind eye to many more incidents where Umar accepted the companions' ahad hadith in far more serious matters than when he rejected a few. Ajaj al-Khatib says, whenever the companions demanded second companions who had heard the narration of the first one from the Prophet, this was done only to provide proof of the validity of the narration, lest one may dispute later on. When the second companion is dead or unavailable to substantiate the latter's narration, this was never done on grounds that a hadith is rejected unless narrated by 2 or more. As for the news purporting that Ali demanded oaths of truth from narrating companions before accepting their hadith, it should be said that Bukhari invalidated this hadith because of its narrator being unknown, majhul. As for the Prophet's discourse in the mosque on being told of his incomplete prayers, Ahmed ibn Hanbal explained this was because the Prophet was told that he had done something contrary to what he thought he had done. That is, it was a question of 1-to-1, and thus the substantiation of others was necessary. On the other hand, as was mentioned earlier, there are plenty of well-documented authentic incidences in which the companions, specifically Umar and others, accepted the ahad narrations of the companions, citing some examples. We have 1. Umar accepted and upheld Hamal ibn Malik's hadith, which says the blood money of an embryo is to free a slave. He accepted Abdurrahman ibn Awf's hadith regarding keeping away from plagued environments and taxing Magians. 2. Uthman ibn Affan accepted Furay bint Malik's hadith that a widow spends her period of waiting in her deceased husband's home. 3. Ibn Abbas changed his viewpoint and accepted Abu Sa'id's hadith, which says that the constituent element of riba is the taking excess money over the actual money loaned with or without postponement. 4. The Ansars who wanted to elect a caliph from amongst them changed their mind and accepted Abu Bakr's hadith that caliphs must be from Quraysh. 5. Ibn Umar accepted Rafi ibn Khudayj's hadith, which narrates that the Prophet prohibited leasing out the agricultural land. The examples are just a few from an ocean of others that show and clearly indicate that the companions unhesitatingly accepted all authentic ahad hadith without any of the reservations upheld by the Malikis or the Hanafis, some very special circumstances notwithstanding. Such circumstances, it seems, all point towards the fact that they simply wanted to ascertain and corroborate the narration because they were not so sure about the memorizing power of that particular narrator, whose narration they were rejecting. For example, Umar cited the Quranic verse 65:1, "Move them not out of their homes, and they must not willingly move out unless they performed a disdainful act," to support his belief that Fatima bint Qais was not very accurate when she narrated that the Prophet said divorced women have no right to demand housing and other expenses need not be borne by their divorcing husbands. Umar further explained that he was rejecting her hadith on the above grounds and thought that because of the apparent incompatibility, she must have been inaccurate in her reporting of the hadith. Ibn Abbas, however, reconciled Fatima's hadith with the Quran by explaining that the Quran was referring to the revocably divorced woman, whereas the Sunnah was referring to the irrevocably divorced. In another instance, we know that Ali rejected Ibn Sinan's hadith that a widowed woman who has not been assigned a dowry is entitled to the dowry of her peers. Ali explained that he thought this hadith was incompatible with the Quranic verse 2:236, "There is no sin upon you if you had divorced your wives prior to assigning them dowers." He said, "We cannot hold the narration of an illiterate nomad in the face of the Quran." Thus his rejection was based not on the ahad nature of the hadith. Ibn Mas'ud, however, upheld the hadith, and Shawkani noted that the Quranic verses pertain to women divorced before being allotted a dawah and not to widows, and the two are not the same. I think it is fair to conclude this chapter by saying that the norm for the companions was to uphold and abide by all authentic ahad hadith, unless the precision and accuracy of the narrator was not confirmed. This line is identical to that of Ahl al-Hadith, who accept all hadith which are authentic unless negated by other more authentic hadith, or unless they are abrogated, or when the ahad hadith were not authentic. It would seem appropriate to end this chapter by quoting Amidi, who says, "Never did the companions reject a hadith for being ahad, whatever the hesitation. That they were abiding by ahad hadith was due either because they thought the hadith was in conflict with another sunnah or Quranic verse, or because some of the poor attributes of the narrator."